Good morning. Welcome to Alaska Commercial Real Estate Today. I'm your host, Phil, and joining me, Alaskan economist and commercial real estate appraiser, Lydia.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, we have a good show today. Today, we're going to be talking about some national commercial real estate trends, in banking specifically, and some Alaskan commercial real estate trends and economic situations. You have some good ones for us today. We have more on the Alaskan front today than the national side. And rounding up our Ask an Appraiser segment, we have questions that you should ask an appraiser. And that'll be an interesting topic. So let's get into what are the national trends of interest in commercial real estate today.
Recently, Fed officials have signaled their intention to lift the Fed rate above 5% in 2023.
Right. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago on our show, and we briefly touched on what the rate is, why it matters, and why those of us who are in the industry, whether it's commercial real estate or business valuation or just business in general, really weren't surprised to see Fed rates do what they did for the last year. Partially because the Fed told us what they were going to do. And they've told us that it would continue. And we speculated a couple of weeks ago on how they might continue. But you have more information now on whether we were right or wrong. So who was right?
Well, we were right. I mean, they will continue to increase rates. The real question is how much.
Right. And I said, I don't remember. I think I said 0.5%, and you speculated 1/4. So what is going to happen?
Well, we still don't really know. The meeting is in February. At that point, we all will know.
Yeah.
But speculation is that it will actually be a larger increase than the Fed themselves have stated.
Oh, so they've leaked some speculation. Is it like a Supreme Court leak? Or because that's in the news this week. Here we are. We're going into our 4th week in January of 2023. A little bit of off the subject. National news was that there was a Supreme Court decision of consequence that was leaked way ahead. And so if you're not sure what I was talking about, that was a bad reference to that. So the Fed leaks are a little different, and they probably would actually know who leaked it.
Yeah. Well, it's hints, I think, is more what they do.
Yeah.
You know, and then it's kind of more speculation or predictions on the part of lenders and economists and players in the market. So Bankrate, which is one of the top analysts, predicts that possibly we will be seeing rates as high as 5.5%.
By
if not this first round, which is to be first quarter this year, then the second quarter. So potentially getting high. And we're already above historic rates since 2007.
And so to get there, it has to happen at 1/4 and 1/8 rates, or we're looking at 1/4 or half again. We don't know, but
we really don't know if it's going to be one fell swoop and we're going to see a whole percentage increase here. But potentially that's.
I think Elon Musk might lose his mind if that happens. So Elon Musk has been a strong public opinion in the Fed interest rates and strongly condemning them as really poor decisions for our country and for the health of our country. And the fact that he is actually speculating in some of his public tweets and interviews that the Fed increases may push our country past a recession and into a full-on depression in the way that they've gone about doing this. And so I think that's a little bit overreacting. Historically, we've had much higher rates in healthy economies without getting lost into the weeds of should they keep increasing them or not? What matters is they've said they're going to. It shouldn't be these massive increases as it was last year. But all predictors and all leakers are stating that first or second quarter, one way or the other, will be up at
5.5%. Yes.
Okay. So we can look at 30-year home mortgages will be what? Pushing 7.
Easily, yes. And, for some tiers of lending, that would be even higher still.
Certainly. So the higher the risk, the higher the rates typically, right? And we're all used to that. Used car buy here, pay here rates could get pretty high. I'm not sure how much they go up depending on the Fed rate or not. But so if you're a buy here, pay here or rent to own, they probably had enough room in that 20% interest rate to perhaps absorb some of that. I don't know. Apologize. So rates are going to go up a little bit. My prediction is not as drastic as last year, but they're still going up. Your prediction?
I'm thinking that, yes, it's possibly first and second quarter. And I think it by then might see no increase or no small increase at that point. Really, it comes down, the Fed is concerned about inflation. It's not about triggering a recession.
They're not worried about those that buy here, pay here on their furniture.
Right. So it's really trying to adjust inflation back down to our, normal range.
Without getting too political, there was some printing of money that has happened, and without expressing opinions of whether that was a good idea or a bad idea, what matters is it happened.
Right.
And it had a known at the time, perhaps not widely publicized, but those who understand what happens when you print money understand that it drastically affects inflation. And the Fed's number one job is to fight and control inflation to keep it within acceptable limits that promote a healthy economy in our country. They're not really mandated to do anything else. That's their one job, why they were supposedly created, and we're not getting a Jekyll Island stuff, right? That'll truly toss you down a hole that you don't want to go down to. Read that book. It's a great book if you have no idea how the Fed works or why it was started, called The Creature from Jekyll Island. But we won't talk too much. It's not a book. We're not reviewing the book, but you should read it. So what else nationally is? So Fed rates are going to go up. The next meeting is scheduled for February.
I believe early February.
Yeah, I thought it was the first week in February, which means about 2 weeks from today.
Right.
And
we'll see where things go from there. But really, this affects both sides of market transactions. It affects
buyers, sellers, residential, commercial.
Yes.
And government rates as far it does actually trickle down eventually into treasury rates and other percentages. A lot of things are affected.
Yes.
A lot of people don't realize that even their insurance rates are affected by interest rates. There are a lot of things that affect
credit card rates.
Right.
Car loans.
Car loans.
So it's a dramatic effect on many assets of
of our everyday life in and out of banks.
Yeah, professional and personal life.
Personal life, yeah. So and not in our personal life, but in others. There's the what about like in Vegas with gambling and bookies? Do we know if they change their rates? Does that get affected by? Hey, if you know that, drop a comment or send us a message. Don't say anything that'll get you in trouble, and I'm not looking for a bookie, but I'd be interested to know if interest rates affect that market as well, or like the illegal sports gambling market. Does it
matter?
I don't know. Well, it matters when they have to refinance their home or business and get an appraisal. to pay back their bad decision.
Right.
I don't know. I don't get very many of those calls. So that's the national news for today. What else do we have going on? We have a lot of Alaskan news. What's going on in Alaska, Lydia?
Well, locally, it's been announced via Alaska Business magazine that a tower at the Anchorage airport is proposed that would possibly be the tallest, if built according to plan, tallest building in Alaska.
In Alaska?
Correct.
Oh, well, and we've appraised you appraised the tallest apartment building
Yes.
in Alaska. You
One of the first
appraised
ones built.
the tallest apartment building in Ketchikan, I believe, although they had some help because it was on a mountain.
Right.
Let's see. What else have we done that's the tallest? And when you think about structures in Alaska, we don't tend to have the super tall structure because we're earthquake zones.
Right.
But we're talking about the control tower. So there is a new control tower designed and set. When do they begin construction?
The exact
Or what phase of planning are they in yet still? Is this still very preliminary or do we know?
Well, FAA has started their design plans, but as far as a actual timeline, that has not been released.
Oh,
The existing tower is too small for the operations at Anchorage, and cargo and air passenger travel is pretty significant.
Yeah, the Anchorage International Airport, Ted Stevens Anchorage International, it is a very, very busy airport. Let's see. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I flew in. We have the two primary runways that are used. We don't have any parallel in-use runways yet, but Anchorage International also, that tower is involved in the Lake Hood seaplane and gravel strip, and a lot of tourists fly into International on large passenger and then go across to Lake Hood to go out on seaplane excursions or access into remote and rural Alaska. And it's a very large operation happening. And there's been some recent construction of very large hangar and industrial buildings on Ted Stevens Airport. And so it makes sense that it's getting more difficult for the professionals, the controllers working in the tower, to be able to see what's going on. Now, I'm not aware of any ground incidents. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but I didn't hear of any. And they don't really speculate as to why they need this tower. But it's interesting to me that it would be the tallest, because there are some tall buildings.
There is, but the Conoco building, which is the tallest in Anchorage, is not 300 feet. So it will be potentially the tallest in...
It will be in Alaska.
Yes.
So that'll be interesting. That's big news. Other big news. There's other talk of another airport.
Yes. The Alaska Journal of Commerce announced that Doyon is in talks with Alaska DOT and the Denali Borough about a new airport near the entrance of the Denali Park.
And did they say what size of runway or airport they're trying to construct or plan?
Well, they're in talk in this area because they want to replace the small Ely Airport. And they want to replace it with something of a mile long, which would be able to accommodate large jets.
Yeah, a mile long is a 5,000 foot, and a 5,000 foot runway is still on the smaller side for some jets. But there are some, a 737 is capable of getting into 5,000 feet, depending on how configured. We're not going to take 74s or Dreamliners or anything like that into 5,000 feet, but it certainly would accommodate direct flights from Seattle.
It is possibly could, and I think that's part of the appeal would be to circumvent now bus ride or train ride required to get to Denali from Fairbanks or from Anchorage.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting topic for conversation as far as how it affects the commercial real estate and markets and businesses, small businesses along the way. I don't know that we know how significant the air traffic is going through Anchorage International, being bused up to Denali, but it's not nothing. We know a lot of cruise ships put people on buses and do Denali-based things, and I don't see how that would change.
I think that still will be an option for the cruise industry to use, but the idea is that it takes about a day to travel to Denali, and that's
from Anchorage.
From Anchorage, yes,
or Fairbanks.
It's lost for these cruisers or for tourists in just travel. So the idea would be to shorten that time, and capitalize on maybe more visitors potentially to the park.
Yeah, that's interesting to speculate of how that would affect the face or nature of what excursions or types of vacations Alaskans or visitors to Alaska choose to do, because a large number of our Alaskan tourists go to Anchorage, however they get there, usually by air, but they get there also by cruise ship, and they rent RVs and go to Denali, or they rent a car and drive a beautiful drive on the Glen and Parks Highway. And would that be different then? So that's interesting. What's not interesting is that Doyon would look for a way to cut everyone else out of tourism. But
it's positive for the area. It would bring jobs in the construction phase.
Certainly.
Long-term jobs. It also means more cargo could fly into that area, more emergency services be better equipped. But it also, on the flip side of that, would probably mean less visitors stopping in the Mat-Su Borough on the way.
Mm-hmm.
Since between Anchorage and Denali is all of the Mat-Su area. It's also the same from Fairbanks. I mean, if you fly there instead of drive, then all those communities miss out on the revenue.
An interesting question would be if they intend on operating year-round. Currently, Denali as a park, for the most part, shutters in the winter, and there's not a lot of winter tourism in the area. So did the article mention if they intend to operate year-round?
Well, this is my speculation, is that, yes, it's essentially would allow for winter tourism in the area, for independent operators to provide services in that space. Very common are these dog sledding adventures or skiing type things, snow machine adventures that capitalize on Alaska in the wintertime. Fairbanks is kind of transitioning into more winter tourism for the Northern Lights viewing.
Yeah. So
I think that there's a possibility there.
You mean Northern Light conceptions?
Well, that's a whole nother topic, but yeah.
So if you don't know, there's not an insignificant number of Fairbanks area, but really just northern Alaska, interior Alaska. Is it all Asian, or is it a certain religion? We know them to be largely Japanese, and that could just be because of financial means. But it's supposed to be, under their belief structure, some sort of a blessing for the child, or favor in the child to be conceived under the Northern Light.
It's a thing.
Well, it's enough of a thing that it's a significant number of winter tourists every year in Alaska. And it's a very common honeymoon destination from Asian countries. And we'll take it. They tend to be great tourists. They're very curious. They're very conscientious, and they're not hard on the land. They don't come and trash our land. And as Alaskans, we appreciate a tourist that comes here, practices some form of leave no trace or tread lightly type tourist activity, and they tend to give a fair amount of money to local businesses, local lodges like the Chena Hot Springs Lodge, or like one of the properties that we were a part of in new development that are specific domes for winter, capturing that winter tourist travel. And we love being a part of unique properties like that. We've done tree houses, clear heated domes. Let's see, what yurts that you could only get to by boat. All kinds of unique types.
The Alaska Adventure model.
Right, adventure tourism.
Right, and that's growing substantially in the Fairbanks area.
It is.
I think the Denali area could potentially capture some of that.
Way more so. A lot of the Denali area currently is owned by Princess Cruises and other cruise ship-based non-Alaskan entities that shutter in the winter and hire non-residents in the summer, and a lot of that money leaves Alaska. So maybe Doyon's onto something, that if we build it, they will come and more local Alaskan businesses will benefit from it. Well, that's something that'll be interesting to find out.
Potential there, for sure. I mean, and certainly something that the Healy community could benefit from long term.
And Healy has an outstanding Three Bears with a great outfitter lodge.
Yeah.
And if you are looking for ammunition in Alaska, that is one of the best places to stop by. I'm giving away the secret, right? If you can't find something in Anchorage or Fairbanks, chances are they have it in Healy, which is great. It's a great spot to stop on your way up the Parks Highway, and we encourage everyone to do that. What else is happening in Alaska?
Well, that's one of the infrastructure projects that have been talked about, but there's also been several oceanside seaport projects discussed that would be a big benefit to the Alaska tourism industry as well. The Seward, Alaska Railroad terminates in Seward, and they've been talking about and planning to expand the cruise ship dock in Seward.
Okay.
This is also on top of a freight dock expansion in the extent that it would expand the dock 500 feet in order to accommodate the mega cruise ships that we start to see in Southeast.
Deep water ports, 5,000 people. It's a big deal to accommodate mega cruise ships.
Right. And the Alaska Railroad directly benefits from the cruise ship industry.
Certainly.
Seward is been one of those destination places for the railroad for summer visitors. They also go to the Denali area and Fairbanks area, but Seward is one of their bigger ports of call for cruise ship passengers.
Seward is large on tourism, and the Alaska Railroad ferrying tourists, because they can go from Seward all the way to Fairbanks on the railroad. And that is the absolute best way for tourists to travel Alaska, as far as I'm concerned, because it keeps them off our highways. We have one 2-lane road with not a lot of passing opportunities the majority of the way from Seward, to Fairbanks. There are very limited in the size and capacity of our roads. And so the more that tourists can get onto the railroad and stay off the highways, the better and safer it is for everyone. Because
exactly.
While it looks like a tourist byway or a scenic byway, it's not a Blue Ridge Parkway with lots of pullouts. And that doesn't keep them from stopping when they see a bear or a moose.
That's right.
And quite sadly, people die every year from it. It really is quite sad. It's a serious problem, joking aside. Please get off the road and stop stopping in the middle of the highway. A personal plea. Please stop doing that.
Yeah.
So what else is happening across Alaska in commercial real estate?
Well, that's this first project of expansion of a dock. But in Whittier, they're also discussing creating a dock for a cruise ship. facilitated by the Corps of Engineers, which has provided the land to the city to utilize. Again, this would probably be a joint project, most likely a native corporation, city, state kind of endeavor to allow Whittier to accept some cruise ships, which they currently don't. But it wouldn't be anything on the large scale as Seward is, but enough for them to get some of the smaller.
So we do get smaller, not mega cruise ships, but some of the cruise ships will make their way up the glacial fjords in the Whittier area. But I wasn't aware that the docks in Whittier were not large enough. We have a ferry dock. There's a ferry that runs, the Alaska Marine Highway ferry that runs from Whittier to Valdez and Cordova, and that's one of those runs. But it's kind of a small boat harbor in Whittier.
It is, yes.
And there's some very neat historical significance. There is the very famous, the Baggage Towers, and the abandoned World War II barracks building, and some eco-tourism that happens into the area. But currently, due to the nature and size of the port and getting in there in the fjord to Whittier, and the fact that the only other way to get there, railroad or road, takes you through a tunnel, unique in the world, 6 miles, 8 miles, I forget how long it is, one way at a time tunnel.
Right.
And so some people find that interesting to go and do, and it is. But outside of that, there's not a lot of opportunities in Whittier. There's one restaurant, there's kind of one hotel, and after that, there's really just kind of one big building, and then some smaller industrial.
It is a small community. It's less than, I think, 300 people that live there year-round.
They do have an airport. It is a challenge to get in and out of. It is short, gravel, and right up against the mountain.
Yep. So, I mean, this would increase revenue for Whittier in the head tax that is applied to cruise passengers, as well as sales tax.
Certainly.
It would be a smaller scale dock, so it wouldn't overwhelm the community so much as these large mega ships
tend to do.
So less people, less of an imprint. Be more cruise industry in South Central, which South Central typically is secondary to Southeast, the cruise industry. And
absolutely,
it's a lot of development, and many entities are going to be involved with this. The feds are going to get involved with They
still own most of the land around Whittier.
Yes, they're talking about a campground there, as well as some other.
Yeah, I think there is a campground. It's limited and pretty primitive. We haven't been there in a long time, so
yeah. So it's a positive thing, I think, for Whittier.
Hard to say. So as persons who enjoy taking small boats to Whittier to access the Prince William Sound, I have mixed feelings about how excited I am to see Whittier become more crowded. For sports fishermen and hunters alike, the Whittier small boat harbor and portion of the Prince William Sound is a real gem. Not duplicated by Seward, not duplicated by Valdez. It has its own uniqueness that a lot of us don't want others finding out about. So I've got mixed feelings about this. I'm not too sure, Whittier, this is a good idea or not.
Like I said, it's
how dare you make
community.
Money at the expense of my fishing?
A very small community, so it is unique in a lot of ways.
It is, and there's good people in Whittier. And joking aside, if the good people in Whittier, hardy people, want to do it and can benefit from it, then we support that, and we're behind you. Good luck with that. Interesting, big project.
Yes.
What else?
That's the extent of the infrastructure construction on in the pipeline for the state. Some of these are closer to realization than others. The sewer dock is expected to be completed by 2025. Okay. As well as the Whittier dock as well. So it's those are a lot closer than probably these the Doyon airport.
That's very preliminary, and
Right.
federal, international airports take time to develop and construct, and it's
Yes.
the construction season to do that type of a project is rather short in Alaska, and even with the ferries. But Seward and Whittier are in a more temperate climate zone. They're actually in rainforest, as opposed to the Healy, Nenana, Denali area, which has a significantly shorter building season.
Right. That does affect things, as well as the location of the airport. There's not a lot of privately held land in that area. Mostly it's federal, state, native land. I believe that they're looking at...
Doyon's got a fair amount of land in that area.
I believe they're looking at state land for this project, because state would ultimately...
Well, they're not going to build it on their own land.
The state would ultimately run the airport, but the terminal that would be co-joined there is expected to be run privately, or from...
Well, if the state, the feds, and a native corporation or two are involved, then it's going to be very political.
It is. It already is. Federal funds would
Going to be a lot
would
of
be
opinions.
involved. The state as well, because
Right.
of the nature of our airports. A lot of them are state run.
Yeah, most of our airports in Alaska are owned by the state.
So it really is a joint venture project, but it's something that the area is in desperate need of, given the small strip that's available there, the limited air travel.
There's a couple. Well, there's significant air travel up and down that corridor.
Yes.
As most, most aircraft that are making that transition from the South Central Alaska up to interior Alaska do travel a flight path that most of the trip follows the Parks Highway. So they're going right by there most of the time. Even the larger commercial air traffic tends to follow somewhat along that route, and Great Circle wise, it goes that way anyway. So there's a lot of good reasons, which is not to discount the weather or mechanical alternate. So the distance between Anchorage and Fairbanks is significant, and I would gather that compared to the lower 48, I doubt there are distances that far that don't have runways large enough for emergency landings. There's just no alternate heading that way if you're in a large airplane. So while there are small 1,000 to 2,000 and even 3,000 foot strips, almost none of them paved, those make very bad choices to land on in a mechanical emergency. So there's a safety aspect to be considered for sure.
I think that's really what the community's looking at, is the ability to accept emergency service via aircraft, leave cargo as well. It
would cut down on a lot of the trucking traffic
right
on what is a somewhat treacherous road. Now, it's not the Hall Road up north treacherous, but it is one of those roads that is affected by geothermal and tectonic activity and frost heaves. And it becomes at some point near impassable, or certainly not practical, no matter the fact that it's under constant construction.
Yeah.
It is a very difficult road to maintain. And it just might make a lot of sense to start doing more air travel that way. So the idea is sound on a lot of points. And overall, it's good for development, which means it's probably good for Alaska in this way. And it's good to see a native corporation spearheading the move, which means there's good support amongst people who live there, own land there, and would benefit or be affected positively and negatively by it. So overall, it's a good move.
Yeah, I think so. That community is ripe for a lot of new development or a different model of development.
a different model of development would be good in that Alaskan, whether native or not native, but Alaskan owned company, land, people. I like to see that development. So much of our development in that area has been federal or federal mixed with really not even American development. So a lot of these cruise ship lines, that they're not even American companies, and they own land and lodges and significant portions of, and control significant portions of that tourism, whether they're open or not. So Good move. I think this will be a good move.
Yeah.
Good. What else do you have?
Well, real estate statistics. Anchorage Municipality and the Kenai Borough had a record number of commercial real estate sales in the past 10 years, last year, 2022. Now, the Mat-Su Borough, though, their best record commercial sales was 2021. So they actually had less commercial sales in 2022 in the Mat-Su Borough.
Are we seeing a flip? So the Mat-Su Borough has been the hottest real estate market in the state of Alaska for a decade.
It's tough to say because a lot of new construction's happening out there. So those technically
There's still room to build.
Right. Are not reflected in these commercial sales. These are commercial existing
sales
properties.
Yep.
So it's interesting to see though the stability though. I'd say in Mat-Su Borough of days on market has stayed the same relatively over the past 4 years. Whereas, Anchorage is how it's seen some very high days on market in the past and honestly recently as well. Probably because of...
Yeah, I'm not sure if Anchorage is not done shooting themselves in the foot with some of their political decisions.
Yeah.
And Anchorage is paying a cost for some decisions that the voters must have supported because they were very political. Things went to vote. I mean, they have people who are elected by the people, and I didn't see anybody getting recalled, so they must have wanted what they had happen there, despite the very vocal small minority of those who said they didn't.
Right. But record number of transactions in the commercial sphere in the
2021.
2021 in the borough, Mat-Su Borough, and then in Anchorage just last year.
Yeah.
And an increase of sales. Although, I would like to look at this a little further.
That's a mixed bag, right?
Yes.
A lot of sales is also indicative of people fleeing a market.
That is true.
And there's a lot of office space, warehouse space that's been vacant for a long time, open for lease, on price reductions, still on the market.
Yes.
And as we spoke about last week, some of those having been listed for over 1,000 days.
Yes. And if the listing price and closed sales price has decreased in the past year over year as well. So that's another indicator.
In the Anchorage market.
In the Anchorage market. So we saw a decrease in the average sales price occur.
Right. And some large properties moved.
Yes, some large properties have moved, which is not typical to see as many larger
turnover
size properties. Yes.
Yeah.
Or available and for sale or vacant.
Well, interestingly, in the 2008 to 9 crash that was experienced in the lower 48, Alaska, while we can't say they were unaffected, they certainly were not affected in the same way. And the economy in Alaska, the economy in Anchorage and the Mat-Su particularly, then was strong enough that it seemed to steamroll through the challenges that the lower 48 experienced, which is to say we experienced them here also, just not in the same way because we had such a strong other economy to lead through. That's a very different picture now.
Yeah, what we saw then was migration to Alaska because the lower 48 was experiencing a recession.
2009, 2008, 2007 even, because
Yes.
the South seemed to crash first last time, certainly in the new construction and residential. And we saw a lot of companies and people come to Alaska from those regions to develop
Right.
what was needed then, single family housing.
Yes, and what happened then is we had this a boom of population growth, but our construction industry was lagging on capturing and meeting that demand. And we didn't have a boom in construction until 2014, really, of single family and multifamily homes to capture that growth. So the cycle in Alaska is very different than the lower 48. I wouldn't want to go so far as say it's the opposite, but it certainly is not the same indicators that we see here that we would see in the lower 48, and especially in the last financial recession.
And we saw a dip in Alaska in the 2014, 15, 16, arguably through up to COVID. So I know we in looking at the various economies and markets of Alaska, we're getting excited about evidence of growth and healing and recovery from the 4-year recession we had been in as the effects of COVID began to hit the country. And of course, Alaska was not immune from that. So I don't know that, we ever formally recovered from the recession that we were in, that the lower 48 was not in at the time. But it was an interesting economic situation here to have tourism as a lifeboat at the time and leading the charge for a recovery when tourism got completely eliminated for 2 years. And that's, we talk about the tripod, right? Alaska is an unhealthy tripod of economies.
Right. Yes. So tourism did affect Alaska significantly, and I think we have not recovered from that, as we talked about with the cruise industries last week. They are not at capacity yet. They expect to be this coming summer, this coming season.
The forecast, for some reason, is good. And I don't know that I understand geopolitically. I'm not sure that makes sense.
Yeah, it's tough to say where they expect the actual passengers to come from. If they're expecting that to be international travel, or if that's expected to be called revenge travel, with people who missed out for the last few years on
right, haven't gotten to do what they wanted to do.
Right.
And by year 3 or so, we're going to find a way.
Right. So if that's going to be more domestic travel, or if we're going to see, because of strong international market, see more international travelers. Now, of course, cruise passengers are a mix of all of that. They have passengers from all over the world typically on their cruise ships. So it's really tough to say without looking at their actual numbers, but I anticipated that growth is happening in cruise industry, as well as airport traffic has also almost reached, or did at the end of 2022 reach the same level as 2019 for air travel passengers.
2019 being a positive year for Alaska and the economy.
Right.
Indicators were looking great. 2020, by all means, we thought was going to be the first year in recovery. So 2019 was good for Alaska.
So yes, so 2019 has been the benchmark for all of our...
Looking back,
Yes.
have we recovered
Have we recovered?
from the pandemic?
Correct. So when we look at that recovery, as far as the one leg of the three-legged stool of Alaska's economy is tourism, then we'd say we didn't make it in 2021 or 2022 even back to that 2019 level. but we're looking at numbers, at least in air traffic passengers, of getting to that point in this winter, last 2022 fourth quarter. So they expect that this summer potentially could be as good, if not better,
Yeah.
than 2019. So it's a positive thing in a lot of areas. We talked about a lot of small communities that rely on tourism market, sustain them all year.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in tourism is that during unstable global times, tourists tend to stay in their own country or region, and in stable or good economic, or as in non-war times, they travel abroad more freely. And so if the wherever your tourist is expected to come from, the geopolitical situation matters significantly in that
does.
model, which is interesting because the hotel industry is often a great predictor. They have thin margins, and so they're watching geopolitical scenes and even health abroad. One of the first indicators that we received as watchers of the Alaskan economy, which is a largely tourist-based economy, hospitality is huge. A solid third of the real estate appraisals that we do are hospitality related, maybe even more in some years. We started to receive evidence or indicators in mailings and letters about a sickness coming out of Asia in January of 2020, which is why when it became something, we weren't altogether caught off guard, and we were already watching to see if those indicators would show up here in our markets. And then ultimately, of course, it wasn't just affecting Alaska, it ended up affecting the entire globe.
Right.
So, but watch tourism, watch hospitality for your leading indicators of economic impact from geopolitical, because they watch it closely. So,
Yes, definitely.
so what else do you have some other market data for us? That's Matsu and Anchorage. Anything from what's happening up in Fairbanks?
It's difficult to crunch numbers. They have a different MLS system, so it takes me a little longer
Yeah, they do.
to kind of gather data. But I would like to dig deeper into
It's a lot more expensive too.
these numbers. The sale to list ratio, I like to watch. I think that's very telling on a lot of cases of.
It's certainly an indicator of whether the real estate agents or salespersons or brokers in that area of how scared they are. Because when they're
Yes.
confident, they don't reduce price.
Yeah, it tells you a lot about, for one, sellers' expectations and the days on market, how long they're willing to wait, and then how many reductions and how much of a reduction you see. So it gives you a lot of good information about the market. Look at those ratios. Of course, it's not a be-all, end-all for in certain areas, because a lot of sales can happen outside of MLS depending on the area. So you might not capture everything that's happening, but
And a lot of that drives the financing, right? So what we see in communities where it's difficult to get financing is there are more private party, non-MLS transactions that takes place in hard money lending or owner financing, of course. And in recent years, because of what's happening in the markets of financial markets in the lower 48, that has affected cash buyers around here. There's a lot of tendency in the last 1 to 2 years to use what's perceived as cash, but ultimately is their own retirement investments, savings, cash out of other types of investments, and using that as their purchasing power in Alaska, and especially in Alaska, that's affected our markets.
Oh, for sure. Yes. And not all of those are listed with an agent, so therefore are not recorded as a statistic that I could see,
Right.
readily.
Luckily, we have a good database of private clients because some of the smart investors still get an appraisal. And so as such, we have that transaction data to use in your database, which is a good reason to hire local competent real estate appraisers for these types of things, because you have a tremendous database of private sales that didn't happen on the multiple listing service, didn't utilize real estate brokers or professionals, and happen directly. And that's a lot of those are market transactions.
Yes. I mean, you see some non-FDIC type banks.
We have
hard lenders.
some hard money lending. Yes.
That
We're doing one right now for hard money lender.
yes, that would still do the appraisal process, even though they're not required. It is a good indicator of value from a third party.
Especially some of these multi-million-dollar commercial deals. There's just not a good reason not to get an appraisal unless you can't find a competent local appraiser, which I understand in Alaska. There are a lot of less than competent appraisers in Alaska.
Yes.
One of the best indicators is if they don't have a license to appraise in Alaska, but that's a topic for another day. We have a less than competent professional licensing board in Alaska, and it causes a lot of problems. So what else is, as we say, so Fairbanks data is difficult, but in speaking with the market participants in Alaska, or in Fairbanks, the lenders in Fairbanks, the builders, the engineers, some of the professionals that we have access to and dealings with on a regular basis, what I continue to hear is kind of a repeated mantra in Fairbanks of we need multifamily housing consistently. And so there's more planned, there's more being lended on. It is common, it's happening a lot. There's a lot of movement in the multifamily, residential, right, or multifamily properties. And the trend that started, I don't know where, but it's a common thing in South Central that we've seen has been the detached multifamily. And that's starting to catch on up in Fairbanks.
Yes, I think there's been some tax incentives from the tax authority, the Fairbanks Borough,
Fairbanks North Star Borough,
and the communities of North Pole and Fairbanks especially.
There's a lot of development in North Pole.
Yeah, yes, they are in need of housing, and it's a real thing. They've had an influx of military personnel.
Yep.
And the base cannot accommodate all of them.
First, we saw the Stryker Brigade was a big deal a couple years ago, and that was a large increase in families in the Fairbanks area that came along with that. And more recently, the announcement of and implementation of the F-35 squadron there and all the personnel associated with that. And of course, whenever there's a new type of unit, whether it's the type of airplane or a type of fighting vehicle, like with the Stryker Brigades, what you end up with is a lot of infrastructure changeover as well. They need new buildings, they need new this, new that. They increase the amount of troops, they need more dormitories and the support stuff that goes with it. And we have seen major construction projects, including some private, not private, leased land housing model, especially in the Trainer Gate area. Trying to think what some of the other regions are, all the way across in the southern side of that. And there's just a lot of development. And of course, that benefits local construction crews as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a positive thing. When we talked before about the age of construction across Alaska is getting to be 50 years or more in some areas, the boon of construction of the 80s means that majority of our infrastructure and housing especially is dated and in need of being replaced.
Yeah.
So it's a positive thing for a lot of reasons. Growth in the military sphere in Alaska is positive. I think Alaska is finally getting recognized as a strategic location of the Arctic.
Well, our Senator Dan Sullivan has been pushing and arguing of the unique positioning and characteristics of Alaska for military opportunities and otherwise. And he's been a good champion for the state and for development of the state. And I know that, to get into the infrastructure bill recently would be extremely political. We won't dive into there, and whether that was a good idea or a bad idea ultimately for the country or for Alaska. But all of our politicians at the federal level have fought to grab pieces of that and bring it to Alaska. And so some projects are, as we say, looking good and happening, and others we've been working on for a long time. So it's interesting. That's an interesting situation. So that's Fairbanks, Anchorage, Mat-Su, Kenai Peninsula. Any updates there in the commercial markets down here?
Not especially. I mean, typically the Kenai Peninsula Borough is a slower market. But they had a record year last year as well, a record number of commercial sales. Days on market has been stable for the past few years, and some fluctuation in pricing, which we expect to see. But overall, more transactions is a good thing typically. The movement in the market is, especially in the last few years, has been a positive. Seeing some changeover of new uses, or seeing some of operators that are retiring. So kind of a change in overall, really, in some of the commercial areas of some new ideas coming into fruition.
Yeah, in the Soldotna Kenai markets, we've seen some transition and indicators of movement when it comes to old or retiring or shut down businesses, and we're not watching them go dark and sit there for forever. We're seeing new ideas or similar types of business actually acquire them and pick them up and pick up that mantle and go to run with it. If you're not aware, the Moose's Loose is a very popular tourist destination in the Soldotna area, and the family that ran that for decades walked away, sold it, and moved on a couple of years ago. The new buyer ended up, for various reasons, deciding to sell, and that's become public here recently. There's a new company going in there, and they're not coming in from the outside. It's a local company in Soldotna growing with a good organic growth, and they have purchased and are in the process of converting it towards their use. And it is public to say who they are now, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So the business going in there is
a Thai restaurant, a local
from Soldotna.
From Soldotna. Yeah.
Not the one from the Soldotna Blazy Mall, despite Facebook speculation. They are staying where they are. They're growing healthy where they are. But other than that, it's been public information now that Buckets is pending sale for, I think, about 2 months now. We'll see if it works this time for them. There's movement again down in along the Pioneer Avenue in Homer, and some business transactions there. Little Mermaid transition to a new ownership. Did they remain the Little Mermaid, or did that change?
I believe it was some of the employees that purchased it, so I believe it's staying the same.
So that's exciting. And we saw a couple of boardwalk businesses down on the Spit change hands, and some new businesses open.
Yes.
So It's exciting to see movement, and not just negative movement out of the area, but local people stepping up to try new things, and some of the historic businesses and companies that are tourist attractions in not just the Kenai Peninsula, but all of Alaska. Thorns Lounge comes to mind as another one that has transacted in this last recent years. And of course, we've done most of those appraisals.
Done quite a few of those, yes. We've seen some old restaurant buildings that have been reinvented, some new use.
Revitalization of space.
Yes.
A lot of improvements. And as you talked about, as some of these 1980s and even older properties are really nearing the end of their remaining economic life or useful life, literally the buildings are falling apart, right? We're seeing money get pumped in to fix them, to bring them up to, maybe some modern standards, some more, structurally sound improvements, repairing of earthquake damage that's been existing for years. So it's good to see some of those things happen.
Yes.
One of the reasons you want to hire a competent local real estate appraiser is that you have seen the earthquake damage in a lot of these buildings. And so, believe it or not, a seller might feel motivated to cover up
Right.
structural damage to their building when they're trying to sell it for top dollar. And if you're a buyer, you might want to make sure that someone local and competent was chosen. It could be a big difference.
Yes. I mean, when it comes to damage, especially structural damage, it can be very expensive endeavor and almost negate, the
More than one sale has fallen
yeah.
through after exposure to the cost of correction or the cost of cure was beyond the benefit
Yes.
of doing so, and such it was a teardown situation.
Essentially, yes, it can be.
I'm just thinking of at least two that I can think of. Of course, we would never
But
violate
Alaskans
trust, but
have their ways of adapting and making do. So a lot of times, you'll see.
well, we talked about last week. One of the best ways that Alaskans find to do that is that they use certain known sales agents to sell cash to somebody from outside.
Right. I mean, you could.
It's a great way to transfer a problem out of yours and into theirs
Yeah.
while making money.
Can certainly lipstick go a long ways. And
Unless you hire someone who knows what they're doing. It's not to say that I am in any way trying to suggest that the real estate appraiser is the expert in finding seismic activity or evidence of structural damage. That's not what I'm saying. But there is known history of which areas were affected and how, and other maybe adjacent businesses, and you saw their damage or a part of it. So there's enough to then insist on or strongly suggest the appropriately licensed engineer, and of course maybe steer you away from someone who perhaps is not as ethical as others. Same when it comes to building inspectors. Sometimes it feels like there's more bad than good. Surely that's not true, but certainly the reputation of who is the best to hire is known by your local appraiser, as opposed to someone coming from outside of the area who may not know.
yes, and any repairs that are done and documented, the good contractors are not going to just decide that they're going to make these repairs. They're going to have an engineer.
They're going to involve someone appropriately licensed
Yes.
to do what they're doing.
And
Right.
have an engineer say, okay, this is what needs to be done to structurally remedy.
Or even just that the idea, your proposed idea to cure is mathematically and
Exactly.
building code
Yes.
approved.
Then having a licensed contractor do what the structural engineer recommends. When you have a paper trail that shows these things, it means much more for the longevity of that building, for the value of that building, because you can trace back and see, okay, maintenance was done, things were repaired appropriately and correctly.
Well, I think that's a good point. One of the things that is a strong indicator of a problem is just like a older vehicle or an older airplane or an older anything, if there is no repairs documented or the appearance of it's never needed to have any, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense in Alaska.
Right.
In the earthquakes that we have and the winters that we have.
Right.
Septic systems do have a life. Certainly all construction materials are not the same, and they don't last as long or as well. And you should see a history of repairing and replacing them. And if you don't, well, then that's a reason to perhaps have to hire another professional to come in and evaluate whether they're trying to cover it up or have never done it, which is not surprising here, that they really have never touched a single system since the mid-'80s.
Yes, and we see that quite often.
Original boilers, original plumbing,
boilers, and original roof,
original everything, well-worn, and weirdly, moving in the winter covered in snow.
So yes. So again, ask questions. Ask questions,
and when they don't make sense, hire someone to verify. The trust but verify thing is a really important in real estate.
It is,
and in business,
and appraisal world. It is especially
right. So tell us about what happens when receipts and history of things like that are not given to you as a real estate appraiser. What do you then have to do as far as, where you're going to pick that line of condition and quality?
Yeah. So not knowing a record of or seeing a history of maintenance and repair requires the appraiser to have to determine what condition the property is in.
Right.
And if there's evidence, sometimes there is quite a bit of evidence. I can think of one property.
It can be good evidence.
I walked into the buckets all over the floor.
Oh, you're not the company buckets. There were buckets on the floor.
No, I mean buckets with water.
I know what you're talking about, that roof. That was a lot of roof to replace.
It was. So, I mean, sometimes there's a lot of evidence that there's a major issue. Sometimes there isn't. And sometimes it's just the floor hasn't been replaced in 40 years. The walls haven't been painted or things like that, which would kind of give you an indicator, and it goes towards the condition of the property. So as in an income approach, the appraiser is supposed to estimate what the maintenance, typical maintenance and repair would for that property. If your property hasn't had any of that done, the appraiser is probably increasing the amount needed for maintenance and repair.
You're going to have to pad the reserves, and if they can't give you actual numbers of appropriate levels of maintenance expense, then you're going to have to guess.
Yes.
Or assign what's an industry standard.
Yes.
Except, tell me that it makes sense or doesn't. Are you not going to go on the more conservative side of not getting it wrong? And how does that affect perhaps the bottom reconciliation number?
Well, yes. So that you can consider it as an expense, maybe an increased expense, because the property maybe has some catch up to do in repair and maintenance. Also, it reflects in the capitalization rate that's selected for a property,
which is a direct indicator of risk.
Exactly. So that the risk of that property having major structural issues or components that are past its economic life would be considered in the capitalization rate, among other factors, of course, but it can be part of the reason for the cap rate being selected for that property, as well as higher cost to operate. So it affects the property in a lot of ways. When there's a big unknown, when was the roof last replaced? A lot of people don't really know. A lot of times they don't know.
Yeah, especially if they're the second, third, fourth owner.
Right.
If it's a high transition property that changes hands every 3 to 4 to 6 years or so, it could have been 3 or 4 owners back.
Right.
And a lot of people either choose not to maintain the records or think that it'll be beneficial to just not share them with the appraiser.
Yes,
and
well,
that's something we run into as well.
That's a tactic that's taken a lot, is that I don't know is the right answer. Typically, it's the more information you can give the appraiser, the better, because it does allow them to have more discernment and knowing how much has been maintained and repaired. Maybe you've done more than your neighbor. Maybe you've always gone up on the roof every year and made sure that there's no.
You could show pictures.
Sure, of course. So there's things that the appraiser can see to say, okay, they went above and beyond. They've done their routine maintenance at a minimum, and they've done major maintenance when required with a professional, with someone licensed. And
it's very acceptable to say, well, I haven't replaced the roof, but I've been up there every year and I've replaced or repaired shingles or whatever, or we go up and we reseal, or we go up and we whatever. Or I have a guy go up once a year. We shovel it. We do lots of things. A lot of roof collapses this year. So,
and in our local area,
I shovel every year. I shovel, right?
In our local area, have several collapses, but also several pitched roofs added.
Yeah, exactly. In Soldotna, the
two of them.
Oh, what was it? CarQuest just added a pitched roof. They did a great job. We watched it happen. They did a really good job. It looked like it was constructed well.
As well.
Oh, I didn't see that. So
it's
a good idea.
It's especially when you have an abnormal amount of snow fall within a window of time.
And I would argue that Alaska this year did not see an abnormal amount of snow. We saw it happen a little earlier than what has been typical, but rather we actually got back to what is somewhat of a normal weather pattern for us. So, winter's not over yet. So
it's snow, it's Alaska,
it happens.
It happens every year.
Roof collapses every year.
So.
Amazingly, we forget how to drive every year in the snow. We don't. But. So, those are all great. Great things and great knowledge for people here, but it segues somewhat into perhaps questions that as we talk about professionals being competent and licensed to do what they do, and we've explained some of the pitfalls of where people have gone wrong, either in hiring the wrong professional or not getting a professional involved. But how would someone know what to ask or how to find, and let's just stick with what we know, which is appraisals, and in this case, really we're going to stick with real estate appraisal because that's your expertise, and these questions are slightly different when it comes to a business valuation or an aircraft appraisal. So we'll leave those for another video or another segment, and we'll let you be the expert here in hiring a real estate appraiser, which comes to one of the questions that we sometimes get asked, and something that this will morph from a couple of different questions, and I'll try to put them together and we'll work together to get through these questions. But the overall question when hiring an appraiser, in this case, we're going to focus on real estate. What types of questions should I ask? And the second part of that is my lender has assigned me an appraiser. What types of questions are appropriate to ask? Okay, so you can choose to go find yourself an appraiser, or you can have one assigned to you. And as we try to tell people, even if your bank says you have no choice, or they've given you an appraiser and tell you that you don't get to decide to not use them. One, can you say no? Do you know? I might know some more of these than you know. I handle that contract side and fighting with the banks sometimes. you just do the work. But what would you say to someone who asks these questions of can I say no to the assigned appraiser?
I don't know that no is the first answer. I would say questions are certainly warranted.
I think so. I think you could say no if you get alarming answers to questions.
Of course.
Right.
So, you're encouraged to talk to the appraiser. It's your property.
Yeah.
It's being appraised. So,
or your purchase, or
yes,
going to be your property.
Going to be your property. You're interested in this property. So, questions that you can ask are you licensed? State of Alaska. What's your license type?
What is your license type? So we've talked in previous videos that in Alaska there are multiple types of real estate appraisal licensing, specifically when it comes to someone performing an appraisal for a borrower or even a private client calling an appraiser directly to try to solicit an appraisal. There's really only two types of appraiser. There's the residential certified and the certified general. And we've said in the past that certified general means commercial, in that residential appraisers cannot do commercial, but certified general appraisers can do all property types,
right,
which includes commercial and residential.
Correct.
Some certified general real estate appraisers are very uncomfortable doing residential, single family, duplexes, because they don't do it a lot.
Correct. And that, business decision of what properties they do appraise if you're certified general. You see some certified general appraisers who only do single family.
A lot of them specialize in 5 and 6 plexes.
Sure. So
multifamily.
That's kind of a niche there too, because as we talked about before, you kind of transition from the residential into the commercial there at that 5 unit or
right. When you pass that, last week, when you pass that 5th unit.
Right. So it's
new ballgame.
So the licensing type is important to a certain extent. If you have a commercial property, of course, you want someone that's certified general.
Then it really matters. And most appraisers don't mess that up.
No.
And most lenders don't mess that up either.
Right.
So there are other licensing types. There's what's called an real estate appraisal trainee, and that can be residential or general, but a license to learn. And they're working directly under a assigned and verified to be appropriate supervisor. So there's that. And then there are institutional licensing, and institutional licensing means a person who has demonstrated enough proficiency in order to gain that license, but they are only going to value perhaps bank or institutionally held properties. So this is more the internal, under the lending threshold.
Yes.
They work for the bank, and they're going to just appraise bank properties only. So they're not going to be transactions. They're not going to be, you come to them and you want an appraisal, and they'll assign their internal, institutionally licensed person. That would most of the time be inappropriate and illegal, not always. And then there are appraisal management companies in Alaska now, and that is a type of real estate appraisal license. But that's not a license to appraise real estate. It's a license to hold a panel of appraisers who appraise real estate for the appraisal management company, who then is a different party from the bank or lender.
Right.
And so those are other types that we don't want to get into today. But for the most part, if someone tells you to get a real estate appraisal and you're going to call around and look for an appraiser, what's the first place to start? Where do you go to find a real estate appraiser?
Appraisal Institute.
There you go. Go to the Appraisal Institute. It's not a trick question. Go to the appraisal. Well, if you're in Alaska, you just go to rickerlandvs.com because we can appraise all of Alaska. But no, go to the appraisalinstitute.org. They have a button right on their homepage that says Find an Appraiser.
Right.
Okay. If you're also looking, another place you can find is the AQB maintains a database of licensed real estate appraisers and any enforcement actions against them. So that's a great place, which we'll segue or rather address that a little bit further. But what we're talking about here is when you are looking for an appraisal, one of the questions you ask them is, what is your type of certification? What is your license? Are you a residential? Are you commercial? Because you want to make sure that you are asking for the right appraiser for your type of property.
Right.
All right. I think we got that one right. The next question that we tell people to ask, and why don't you expand on this, for which appraisal company or firm do you work for? Ask this of the appraiser. Ask them who they work for. Why is that important, do you think?
Certainly want to know, what area they cover, what if it's a large company, if they are independent appraiser.
Yeah. I like to know, is it a company that has a license to perform real estate appraisals in Alaska? So there are appraisers who work for companies that aren't a part of Alaska, and just like any other business, if you're going to conduct business in the state of Alaska, you're required to have an Alaskan business license. And that is a separate license from your professional license. And you have to have, and this is why it's important, you have to have an appropriate real estate license to have a business license to appraise real estate in Alaska. And so that's like a second check. Right.
Yes.
And for a long time, we had a problem in Alaska of appraisal management companies that weren't licensed here, who were not bothering to get licensed here, who were soliciting appraisal work here and then assigning it to non-licensed Alaskan or non-Alaskan licensed, meaning people not allowed to appraise in Alaska who are doing it anyway. So that was a problem in the residential world, not necessarily commercial markets.
Yeah, it can be a concern if you're using a lender that's not local, that is going to, what they use an AMC.
They solicit an AMC not licensed here who
And-
doesn't have a panel of Alaskan appraisers.
And send this out to appraisers all over the country.
Yeah. Some will do it. They're out of work.
Well, some of them will. There are products that can be done from outside of Alaska, which may or may not be okay, depending. But it's
AVM based or
a desktop, they call it, where they don't go to the property. So they are relying on whatever information is given to them.
whatever they can find online.
Right.
Sometimes they'll call up a local real estate broker and buy data or try to dupe them. This is unfortunately one of the things we see is they will pose as a potential customer to the broker, feed them the information they're trying to get, and get the broker to provide data.
Right.
And then they'll use that data to perform a desktop. And it's an ugly product all the way around, but it's cheap.
Yeah.
And a lot of lenders have been tempted to
Yes.
use such a cheap product.
There are clearinghouses essentially that are specialized in
Specialize in crap work.
very, very low fee work,
Yeah.
which may or may not be done by a licensed appraiser. So it's
And even if they are licensed, maybe they'll go the DNR right and just not have a license in Alaska. Because if you work for the state, no one's going to
Right.
hold you accountable.
It can be a concern, especially if you have a very unique property.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Alaskan properties are unique, which
Say every property
was every one that we get hired to do. So,
is very unique. So
along those lines, it's important to understand who do they work for. But here's the other reason why you asked that question. Because if you were borrowing from a bank and they work for the bank, legal or not, however they justified it in their head or not, there's a conflict of interest there in that the person performing, the real estate appraiser performing the appraisal should not be an employee of your lender.
yes, I mean, there's many conflicts of interest to that.
There are. But some people will wrap their head in interesting ways and come up with weird stories to justify what's really just not ethical. Most of the time, it's a use patent violation.
Well,
but
it doesn't benefit, especially the buyer, the borrower, if you're borrowing money. But in a buy transaction, as the buyer, there's no safeguards there for you.
Why would you want to do that? Not a good idea.
Why are you trusting the bank who has a vested interest in closing your loan to provide the value of your property that they're going to base your loan on?
Yeah. Lots of red flags, reasons not to do that.
Yes, there's this third party disinterest appraiser.
Appraisal independence is really important for a lot of reasons. And I know you wanted to spend some more time getting into that. We're going to save that as a whole topic for another show because it is important. And it's one of the best reasons why appraisers are so important, that we pay them in a certain way, that we hire them in a certain way, that we regulate them in a certain way, because safeguarding appraisal independence is vital and important.
Yes.
Because as an appraiser, you only have integrity really once, and it's up to you to lose that and screw it up. I mean, it's true for all of us, but especially when it comes to real estate appraisers. So appraisal independence is very important. But what was the other reason? I forget the other reason now. So, but appraisal company, what company do you work for? And just listen to and evaluate what they answer, how they answer, and is it beneficial for you, the answer. Okay. And so similar to that, a lot of persons who've called our office have at times expressed a misunderstanding that they think the way to hire a real estate appraiser is to go to the bank. So we've had this happen. We're going through divorce litigation, and so they decide to act like they're getting a loan, get an appraisal paid for perhaps by their bank or not, just because they don't know how to find a good appraiser. We've had clients that both through the bank referral or outside the referral system, who the bank will either say, well, call us for this area or that area, we're the best, or maybe we're just the most expensive. I don't know. But we get a lot of referrals from the bank, and sometimes they'll hire internally, but most scrupulous banks will not go along with the ruse of a refi or purchase in order to just get an appraisal, right? Not intending on making the loan. That's a bad business decision for them. And, this is why we're doing appraisal education on our show. If you need to hire an appraiser, you don't need to go to a bank.
Right.
It's okay to ask your bank, who do they like, who do they not like, and why.
Sure, of course.
They may or may not answer you. There's liability in that.
Yeah, of course. They cannot choose not to answer, so they don't appear to have bias. But they do keep a list, and they could give you a whole list.
They can. In Alaska, we have a common list. It's the Alaska Department of Natural Resources has a list of approved real estate appraisers. And a lot of people hand that list out.
Yes.
Because they've been through some level of scrutiny to get onto the list. Although looking at the names, I'm not sure what that scrutiny is. There is at least one person on there who's dead. There are 3 or 4 people who haven't appraised in decades. So I don't know what's going on with the maintenance of that list. But I also know that your dual designations are not on that list. And there's at least 2 other appraisers that don't have their designations indicated on that list either. And a lot of incorrect phone numbers.
Yes.
So if you're in Alaska, I wouldn't say go to the DNR list. I mean, I don't care if you do, because we get a lot of work off of there. Our phone number is correct, and we're one of the only people that answer the phone. So that works for us,
And of course, we'll call you back.
Yeah, we'll always call you back. But Appraisal Institute, find an appraiser, which leads into the next thing, the question that we recommend people ask, which is, what professional designations do you have, and from what appraisal organizations are they from? So explain designation.
Well, a professional designation is a way to provide additional education and education.
So if you are designated, you have had a third party outside of the state. So the state starts with your licensing, and they originally certify you. And then from there, you can have professional organizations, which are not the state, that then will prove and verify your designations. And there's advanced education beyond what's required for minimal state certification. And so who designates real estate appraisers? The Appraisal Institute, as I mentioned, and then there's a couple others we don't see up here very often, but there are other professional organizations that do designate some types. And what do those look like?
The American Society of Appraisers and the Rural Appraisers Society.
Agriculture type.
Yes.
Yeah. And ASA, American Society of Appraisers, is also working to designate business appraisals, and they do other type of appraisal, personal property like aircraft,
jewelry, art.
Yeah, so they're good, but there's not a lot of real estate designations with the appraisal ASA in Alaska. We're working to change that. We think ASA are good people, but that's one of the questions you can ask a potential appraiser is, do you have any professional designations? Who are they with? And can you just briefly state or tell us about the types of designations that you might hear for different types? So if I call someone up and I'm looking for residential, what am I looking for?
An SRA.
Right. SRA. That means that they have had all of those things we talked about proven for residential work. And then for commercial, you're looking for
MAI.
An MAI. And we'll throw in, there's new designations now with the Appraisal Institute, that if you're looking for someone to review other people's appraisals, as in you think there's a problem with it or whatever reason. I mean, people review appraisals for lots of reasons, but you're going to look for someone designated as
an AI RRS for residential and an AI GRS.
Right. So those are one of the questions you can ask. What are your designations? Do those designations match up with what you're looking for in an appraisal? What type of product you need? So the next one that we recommend you ask is, how long have you been appraising in Alaska? Have you ever appraised my property type before? And you can even ask how many. So, you know, if you're getting a 7-unit bed and breakfast on the Kenai River appraised, you can ask how many 7 to 8 unit bed and breakfast have you appraised on the Kenai River? That would be appropriate to ask. You can ask, have you ever appraised my property before? And can you speak briefly to that then? So the first thing an appraiser probably should have said is what?
Typically, they're going to ask you what type of property or the actual address.
Right. And so if you've done that, or I know that you, right, because you're calling our company and you talk to me, and that happens in a lot of small companies. You talk to someone else, but they know what they've appraised before. And if in the past 3 years, there's an obligation to say that you have or have not done that property.
Yes.
Outside of that, what do you think ethically? Is there, would it be ethical to not volunteer that you've appraised a property perhaps 4 years ago? What do you think?
A good appraiser is going to acknowledge that they have familiarity of the property.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as, remembering every property you appraise,
that's fair.
Most likely you're not going to remember 10 years ago. Even 5 years ago.
I like to try to list off, and again, we can't always disclose every property that we appraise. We have an obligation to disclose that we did one in the past 3 years, but we don't have to say who it was for. We certainly don't have to share what the result was. So there's some ethics involved in what you should or should not volunteer, but it's okay to ask if they've ever appraised your property, which drives towards, what other similar, and what you're searching for is the appraiser geographically competent to appraise your property? And so let's see, what else is there? You can ask if there's ever been an administrative action. They have to tell you. They don't have to volunteer it, but if you ask them, they have to tell you. And when we mentioned one of the ways to look up licensure is the AQB website. That says whether someone's had a state action against them. Well, in the state of Alaska, do they?
They do. Yes.
They do. So if you look in AppraiserUp to find that license with the state of Alaska, it'll tell you if they've had administrative action and usually what it was.
There's typically a link if it's more recent
To view it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you have questions about what is appropriate, or rather what's a big deal and what's not a big deal when it comes to administrative action, you could always call and ask another appraisal firm, or you could ask the state themselves. You can call us and we can speak about, well, yeah, it's kind of a big deal. I don't know if you might want to consider that, or we might say, well, it's kind of not a big deal. I wouldn't worry about it. Move on. Right. So, and that all leads up to our last thing that we recommend you ask, which is, do you have a current error and omissions or professional liability insurance policy? And what does that cover?
Well, that covers what it is, errors and omissions by
mistake.
By mistake, yes.
Right. Not purposeful. We're not talking about purposeful liability. That's a different type of insurance covered under general liability. There's malicious coverage. That's a separate kind of insurance, which is a good thing to ask for too. Do you have a general liability policy that covers the work that you're going to do, or perhaps covers you if you get injured on my property? That's something to ask as well. Who's responsible for you if you get injured on my property? So we have answers to all of these things. And be wary of an appraiser that doesn't have answers is the thing. So we talked about licensing, and you want to make sure that the appraiser who is assigned has the appropriate license. You have every right when someone shows up to your property to start performing appraisal, or before, to ask to see a copy of the person's real estate appraisal license. And then you can verify this information. And so when we talked about with a bank, can you choose your appraiser? Well, sometimes the answer is no, but depending on the answers you get from these questions, you could certainly go back to your lender and say, well, this appraiser said this thing, or it doesn't have that thing, or, they sent someone to my property who could not show me an appraisal license. And turns out, maybe they're not even licensed as a trainee, which the way errors and omissions work means it's not covered. And you could just say, I'm not comfortable having someone who's not covered by errors and omissions, or who doesn't have sufficient insurance, or who isn't geographically competent. I'm not comfortable with them appraising my property. I think we should find someone else. And that's something you have every right to do. You could also go to another lender. There's good lenders and bad lenders. And if, some fly-by-night online company says, we only use this person, we only do this, well, maybe you should consider a different lender. Do you have any other notes, or what else would you say? Any other questions that I missed that you should ask the appraiser?
Those are all very good questions to ask. Certainly the familiarity with your property type is important.
Yeah.
Alaska is so geographically diverse.
Right.
And even within a community can be very diverse. So it's important that they are familiar with what type of situations unique to your property they would run into, what the benefits of your property are, what might potentially not be, an adversity to your property. So
right, they may not recognize things they should recognize, or know the area, or there's a lot of good reasons to ask for not just type or location, but even just the market. Right? Are they familiar with that type of property in that market, and all those things? So, well, great questions. And if you have a question that you would like to have us address, or research, or something along those lines for the show, you can send it to us at what's our email? It's I think show at akcretoday.com is the website, and it'll be in the notes in the description if you'd like to send us a question. But that wraps up the show for this week. We'd like to thank you for joining us at Alaska Commercial Real Estate Today. We hope you got something out of this episode, and we certainly talked a long time. So we hope that it's good content for you. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.